Today's lesson is going to be about finding a percent of a number. Our first focus area is going to be finding 10% of a number. I like to do this one first because it's often something that most students can do using mental math, kind of as they get the hang of it, which will then really help us with the following problems. So the first thing we need to know, the word of in math means multiplication. All right, so we are doing 10% times 80. The trick is 10% itself is that percent form. It's that ratio compared to 100. So it's not in the best form for multiplying. So what we can do is we can think of 10% in its decimal form. We can also think of it like in its fraction form. Or we could just really think about what happens with these numbers. So I'm actually going to start this off, and let's just think about what 80 is. So in the end, we're trying to find that 10% of 80, but let's start with, well, what's 100% of 80? 100% of 80 would be 80, because if you evolve it, you have all 80. Now we're trying to find that 10%. Well, how can I go from 100% if we treat this just like the ratio that it is? How do I go from 100% to 10%? Well, I'm going to divide by 10. Okay, what's 80 divided by 10? Oops. 80 divided by 10 is 8. Pretty neat little trick we got there. Now, the more and more that we do this, there's actually an even better trick to finding that 10%. We could always divide by 10, but we also could think of it, every time we divide by 10, this decimal point moves over one spot. So, again, in that dividing by 10, we find another shortcut is just think about moving that decimal point over one place to get your next number. Okay? So, let's test it out. We're going to go to the next page. Let's see if you can solve 10% of those numbers. I want you to try these by yourself. Please pause your video now, write down your answers, and we'll compare in a little bit. Okay, how did you do? Did you get all 4 correct? 3, 2, 1, none? So, how I always go about these problems, since we're finding 10% of all these numbers, really using that visual. Okay, if I did 70 divided by 10, that's going to move that decimal point, and I would get 7. 240 divided by 10 moves the decimal. Okay, now on this third problem, we ended up getting a decimal in our answer, and that's okay. It's the same rule of when I'm dividing by 10, I'm going to move it over. In our last problem, I gave you a bigger number. We still moved that decimal. We didn't end up with a decimal in our answer, but it did get smaller. Now, let's see how we can take finding 10% and do a little bit more with it. So what about other percents? So now we are going to use what we know about finding 10% to help us find, let's say, 36% of 20. So I still am going to start. Let's find 10%. What is 10% of 20? I hope you said 2. Okay, move that decimal. Now from here, I want to try to find, let's say, 30%. And how can I go from 10% to 30%? Oh, I can do times 3. Okay, what's 2 times 3? That's 6. All right, so now we're at 30%. Now I need to find 36%. How could I do this? Well, let's go back to that 10% and let's find 1%. And we just did unit rates not that long ago, and that benefit of finding 1 is that we can find any number we want. So how am I going to go from 10% to 1%? Well, I'm going to divide by 10 again. So I'm going to do 2 divided by 10. And that would give me 2/10. Move that decimal point again. Okay, so I know 10% is 2, I know 30% is 6, and I know 1% is 2/10. How can I keep solving this then? Well, what if I knew 5%? Could I do it that way? Let's try that. Okay, so I want to find 5%. Because I know 30% plus 1% plus 5%, that would be 36%. Oh, hey, why don't I take 10 to 5? Okay, 10% divided by 2. Okay, that's 5%. All right, but then 2 divided by 2. Oh, that's 1. Okay. All right, man. Now I got to make this a little bit organized. Got a little confused. Here's what I want to use right here. If 30% equals 6, and I'll put it in order, 5% equals 1, and 1% equals 2/10. If I add everything together, 30% plus 5% plus 1%, that would give me 36%. Okay, and then on the other side, if I do 6 plus 1, or actually I should add my decimals here, so we get 2/10 first, and then 6 plus 1 is 7. Well, that means 36% of 20 is 7 2/10. Okay, there's a bit of work involved in that, but we simply started off with our 10% here, and then just worked away to other ones. Well, okay, I could do times 3 and get 30%. I had to divide it back down to get 1%, and then I divided by 2 and got 5. Now, there's other ways to approach this, and I'm going to teach you other strategies too. But let's try this one out first. So, for these next 3 problems, I'm going to help you get started. Let's find 10% for all 3 problems. So, I'm going to help you get the 10%, and then I'm going to have you pause the video and solve from there. So, what's 10% of 40? Move my decimal. Okay, that's 4. All right. What's 10% of 20? Of 120, excuse me. Okay, move it. Right, that's 12. And what's 10% of 60? Okay, that's 6. All right, so now that we know 10% of each number, I would like you to pause this video now and find the actual percents that we're trying to find. So pause now and solve. I'm going to begin solving now. I'm going to walk through steps so you can see how I do it. So using all of my 10%, if 10%, looking at the first problem, if 10% of 40 is 4, I know that 60% of 40, I'm just going to do a times 6. 60% of 40 must be 24. Okay, just using that 10% equals 4 to go from 10% to 60% times 6. 4 times 6 is 24. Next problem. If 10% of 120 is 12, I know that 40% is going to be 48. And I get that by doing 12 times 4, because 10 times 4 is 40%. Okay, but I don't want just 40%, I want 45%. So I need to find what is 5%. Well, I can get to 5% from 10% by dividing by 2. So 12 divided by 2 is 6. Now if I add these together, 40% plus 5% gives me 45%. And 48 plus 6 gives me 54. 45% of 120 is 54. And last but not least, 32% of 60. Well, 10% of 60 is 6. So I know that 30% of 60 must be 18, because 10 times 3 is 30%, 6 times 3 is 18. I need to find 2%. Well, 1%, that might help me to find this time. And again, I'm going to do 10% divided by 10, so 6 divided by 10. I'm going to move that decimal point. 1% is 6/10. Okay, so 2%, if I do times 2 between these, do a times 2, that means 2% is 1 2/10. If I add these together, 30% plus 2% gives me 32%. 18 plus 1 2/10 is 19 2/10. So that was finding the percentages using the 10% strategy. On the next slide, I'll teach you another strategy. So now that we've done the mental math way, let's do it with the multiplication way. And you can totally use a calculator or multiply it out on pencil and paper for this one. So going back to previous lessons, we really talked and studied a lot about taking percentages and making them decimals. So hopefully we still remember how to do that. For this problem, we're going to take 35% and we're going to write it in its in its decimal form. So we know that to go from a percent to a decimal, we need to divide by 100. And so 35 divided by 100 would be 35 hundredths. Then we're going to go ahead and multiply that times 60. Whether you do this by hand or with a calculator is totally okay. What we would find is that 35 hundredths times 60 is 21. And you're probably thinking like, oh my gosh, why didn't you just teach us this right away? That was so much faster than doing it with the 10%. You know, something a little bit tougher never hurts you. All I caution you about when you are solving problems in this way, make sure that that decimal point is getting in the correct spot and that your answer is reasonable. We would expect 35% of 60 to be a number less than 60. And if you put your decimal in the wrong spot, you could get a number like 210 or 2,100. And that is not reasonable for 35% of 60. 35% is less than 100%, so we would not expect our answer to be more than 60. In conclusion, I would like you to pause the video now and try solving these next 3 problems. Make sure you write your answers down. I'll be going over them in a little bit. For question 1, I made 45% into 45 hundredths, multiplied that by 90, and I got 40 1/2. For problem number 2, I made 78% into 78 hundredths. I multiplied by 60, and I got 46 8/10. For question number 3, I made 135% into 1 35 hundredths. Now, that may have fooled some of you or tricked you. Just remember, we only divide by 100, which moves that decimal place 2, so be very careful with that. I did that times 40, and I got 54, which is a reasonable answer. Since 135% is more than 100, we would expect our answer to be more than 40. I hope this lesson helped you. Please let me know if you have any questions.